Okay, so moving on then, in the next chapter of Rudolf Steiner's lecture series on the Gospel of Mark, we're up to lecture number 3. And in this lecture, Steiner begins to discuss the miracles that Christ performs, especially the exorcisms and the healings. And he specifically compares them to Elijah. Now, Elijah has been, according to Steiner, reincarnated into John the Baptist, which was traditional, actually. He was thought to be the reincarnation of Elijah. And so he talks about Elijah and Christ sort of stepping into the aura that is created by Elijah. Elijah, he says, in a way, who was the prophet in the 9th century BC under the corrupt king Ahab and his corrupt wife Jezebel, who has an eye for destroying him. And Elijah really is the first of the loner prophets. Prior to him, I think in Samuel, you get the image of the prophets traveling in groups. And they are being persecuted by Jezebel. So she has it in for Elijah. But he's the first sort of loner prophet and one of the greatest who's wandering around. And he performs a number of miracles, some of which Christ repeats. This is partially Christ's connection with John the Baptist and John the Baptist baptizing him. Elijah, for example, he performs the miracle where he sees a widow who's coming out at a city gate. She's collecting sticks. And he says, would you go get me something to eat? She says, I don't really, I'm a very poor woman. All I have is enough, a little bit of dough and some olive oil to make a meal for my son and I. And Elijah says, don't worry about it. Just bring me the food. Bring me what you have. So she cooks up the food. They go back to her little house. She cooks up the food and gives it to him. And then miraculously, it's a bottomless bowl. There's plenty of bread, and they're living off of it for a while. So Steiner draws your attention to the fact that after John the Baptist dies, he is put to death by Herod. After the beautiful daughter of Herodias, Salome, does a sexy dance for him. So Herod promises to give her whatever she wants. So Salome goes back to her mother and says, what should I get? And the mother says, bring me the head of John the Baptist, because he's been talking shit about her affairs and so forth. So she wants him gone. And Herod is afraid to touch John because of his power and his very large following. But since Salome asks him and everybody is there as a witness, he has to keep his word. So he orders John's head cut off, and the head is brought in, given to Salome, and then she gives it to her mother. What they do with it, I don't know, but it doesn't say. But nonetheless, so then his headless body then is thrown into a tomb. And then immediately after that, Christ is there with his disciples in the vicinity where John had been practicing, and John's disciples are there as well. And Christ says, it says Christ felt compassion for them because they looked like sheep without a shepherd. They looked lost. And then, so the disciples say, well, it's getting late. We should get some food. And we don't have enough food to feed this huge crowd that we have here. They've got his disciples and John's disciples to feed. And Christ says, how much food do you have? And he says, the disciple says, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Christ does a blessing. They all sit on the grass, all these people. And he does a few blessings and magically reproduces plenty of fish and plenty of bread, which basically repeats Elijah's miracle, multiplying that bread. And so Steiner just wants to draw your attention to the fact that Christ steps into the role of the aura that is sort of left behind by Elijah and then Elijah John, who is his reincarnation. He sort of steps right into that role. And then he looks at the healings of Christ, and he says, now Christ does have the ability to perform exorcisms and drive out demons, but he does so in a way that's very different from the way that such healers used to do this in antiquity before the Christ event. The incarnation of the Christ being at the mystery of Golgotha took place and changes this to a much more personalistic, person-to-person type of healing that Christ does. Whereas, let's say Steiner says in previous epochs, a healer would simply be like a sort of medium or a channel by means of which he or she would channel magical powers from the supersensible realm, and they would just go right into whatever person he was touching. So there would be a laying on of hands and an invocation of spells or magic spells or whatever it is, and the person would be healed in a kind of impersonal way. You can look at the way back again with Elijah, the way he resurrects her dead son with the widow. He's in with the widow, and she says, my son has died. What am I supposed to do? Would you show up here just to have my son die? And he says, give me the body. She hands over the body, and then he puts the son on the bed. And basically all he does is lie on top of him and invoke God, almost in the exact same way as must have been done going clear back to antiquity, to Mesopotamia and Babylonia, which we'll get to here in a second. It says this invocation to God, and then the child is resurrected. So it's very impersonal in a way there. Whereas with Christ now, the whole point of the Christ incarnation is that he has incarnated the ego into Jesus of Nazareth at the moment that John baptizes him in the Jordan, and the Christ descends from the Son into him. And now he has the ego of the Christ being which has descended down to earth. And so everything is changing into a much more individualistic way of healing. And the ego now brings with it morality and good and evil. So it's a repeat on a higher turn of Elijah and John, but on a higher turn of the spiral now with the Christ event taking place. And so he says, look, for example, at the moment when Christ is walking in a crowd in the miracle where the sick woman who's suffering from a hemorrhage, she's been bleeding forever and no physician can heal her. And all she does is go behind him and grab onto his robe for a second and let go. And Christ feels power leaving him. And he turns around and he says, who just grabbed my robe? And his disciples say, well, we're in a crowd here and you're asking who just grabbed your robe? But the woman comes up to him. She's fearful. And he basically says, well, you're forgiven for your sins because of your faith. You have faith, therefore you're forgiven for your sins. So it's it brings in the ego. And when Steiner uses the word ego, he does not mean it with the negative connotations that we give to that word as inflation, conceitedness, or arrogance, that kind of ego. He doesn't use it that way. He uses it as having to do with the personalistic individual judgment in the sense of discernment, bringing in morality. It's a whole different thing. The way Christ heals as compared to the way it was done in the past. Steiner mentions another example where they heal the paralytic. They're in a house and it's too crowded. 4 guys grab this guy who's completely paralyzed and they can't make room in the crowd. So they open a hole in the roof and they lower him down through the roof. And then Christ heals him. He doesn't even touch him. He simply heals him by saying that your sins are forgiven. So it becomes a moral matter now. It becomes a matter of sin. And the Pharisees object to this, of course, because they say, well, only God can forgive sins. Who are you to do this? But he's the Christ being now, so he can come down and heal people. But morality is involved, and it's a much more person-to-person basis now. It's a little bit like the difference in the ancient Egyptian conception of the afterlife, where if you wanted to navigate your way through the afterlife, all you had to know were the proper spells. All you had to do was memorize the magical spells so that as your Ka was going through the afterlife, you just say the magic spell, you would come up against a closed gate, let's say, or a door. You would say the magic spell and the door would open automatically. So it's very impersonal and it has nothing to do with ethics. There is no judgment involved. Whereas with respect to the Christian afterlife, everything is based on sin and evil. You're consigned to hell, to Dante's hell, if you are a sinner. And so there's a big difference regarding who is saved and who isn't. Has to do with their conduct, the conduct of their lives on earth. So there's a similar kind of analogy to that in the way Christ performs his healings in the Mark Gospel. But now I want to draw your attention to something that Steiner doesn't mention, which I think is interesting in this respect, which is John the Baptist and the fact that he has baptized Christ. And the moment he does that, it's as though he has passed something on to Christ that confers on him the ability to perform these exorcisms. The fact is that the name John is one of the oldest names in the world, if not the oldest name even that we know of, since it is a transformation of Oannes, which is the Babylonian god, who is pictured wearing a fish skin as an outfit. He's sort of a fish, half man, because he was Sumerian Enki, which is one of the great gods of Sumer, who was a patron of exorcisms, and his earlier name was Ea, E-A, which later becomes Oannes in the Babylonian world. And the fish was sacred to Enki. Enki was the primary patron god of the city of Eridu, which was the southernmost city and one of the earliest cities in ancient Sumer to get fully up and running. And at very early sites, where the main temple to Enki was later, a large sort of ziggurat-like building, in early Neolithic levels of the site, going back to about 5,000 BC or so, fish bones were found around a little altar, which argues very strongly, since the fish was sacred to Enki, that his practice was going all the way back there to 5,000 BC, even before the civilization of Sumer is up and running by 3,500 BC. And Enki actually later becomes the astrological sign of Capricorn, which is the goat fish. So the fish is always associated with Enki, and the fish cult, and the name John, Oannes, and the Babylonian version of him is a water god, who is a priest that is in charge of exorcisms, because in the ancient world, when a person was sick, you performed an exorcism on them, and that was part of the healing process. And there's an image here in my Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, which is an excellent reference book. It shows the image of a sick man there. This is the Babylonian image of a person who is sick. On the left there's a demon who is holding this man upside down. So he's sick. So when you were sick, you were thought to be grabbed hold of by a demon. And Nergal there, the god of the underworld, is telling him to do horrible things to this individual. And up above we can see a healing ceremony going on there with a sick man lying prostrate and an exorcist over him. And then on this plaque here from Neo-Babylonian times, it gets even more interesting, because on this plaque, if you can see it, we see the head of the god Pazuzu at top. And Pazuzu is, of course, the demon who possesses Regan in The Exorcist, which is ironic because Pazuzu, though he looks fierce, is supposed to look fierce to drive away evil spirits. Pazuzu was an epitopeic demon in origin, especially associated with driving away Lamashtu, who stole children from pregnant women. So if a woman died in childbirth, or the child died, it was thought that Lamashtu made off with the soul. And you probably can't see her here, but she's on the bottom, riding in a boat, standing up. It looks like she has 4 arms in the center there, but she doesn't. She has 2 arms raised with a lion head and 2 lions below the 2 arms. And she's standing on top of a donkey on a barge there that's a crescent shape at the bottom. And to the left of her is Pazuzu, who is driving her away. And in the middle register there, once again, we see the prostrate sick man. And you probably can't see this, but to either side of him are the fish gods wearing the fish outfit. Each man is dressed wearing the fish outfit of the god Oannes, who is associated with exorcisms. And so, in a way, we can... And there's also the other interesting detail that the Mandeans were a Gnostic cult in Lower Iraq, in the area that was practiced amongst the marsh dwellers there, who live and make all these ancient reed huts, the architectural designs for which probably do go all the way back to Sumer. And you can look these up and see current photographs of what they look like. And there was a cult there that worshiped John the Baptist as their primary prophet, not Christ, John the Baptist, in the southernmost region here of the marshes, which cannot be too far away from the city of Eridu, which was sacred to him. Not only that, there may have been a baptismal cult associated with Enki, since he was regarded as the lord of the Apsu, which is the early word for the word abyss. The Apsu is the watery abyss that he is the lord of. And down in the Persian Gulf there at the island of Bahrain was originally called Dilmun. And the son of Enki, named Enzag, a god named Enzag, had a cult there that may have been associated with a baptismal cult, because we find lots of archaeological sort of water shrines all over the island. And not only that, but Bahrain was thought to be the source of all the fresh waters, because it's unique in the Persian Gulf in that surrounding the island there are all these freshwater springs underneath the water. And so Enki and his son were connected with this cult, which may actually go all the way around the corner to the Indus Valley, where with Mohenjo-Daro, 2500 BC, we find in the southern side of Mohenjo-Daro there the very large, famous bath that may have been a kind of baptismal bath that's similar to a practice that goes on to this day in India, where individuals immerse themselves in a bath and they come out reborn. Exactly what John the Baptist is doing, when he baptizes Christ, sinks him down into the water. And also, one other fact is that the name John is associated with Jonah, the name of Jonah, who is also associated with a fish so far as he is swallowed by the whale. And the whale is meant to represent the underworld, Sheol. And Jonah, in Matthew, Christ even says that the Jonah being swallowed in the whale for 3 days and then resurrected, coming out of the whale's belly on the third day, is a prefiguration of what my fate will be. And then a second Jonah, a greater Jonah, has come, referring to John the Baptist. So he even refers to him because Jonah is the same name as John. So all this cluster of associations around John is connected with exorcisms and the ability to perform exorcisms, which I suspect is connected not only with his name and with the baptismal cult and passing on to Jesus Christ at the moment that the Christ descends, the ability to perform these exorcisms. It's connected to a very long ancient stream that goes all the way back to Sumer, to Mesopotamia, and to the earliest origins of one of their earliest and greatest gods there, the god Enki. So that's Steiner's lecture for this chapter, along with my little 2 cents thrown in there to amplify it. So we'll proceed from there.